The patrons have spoken with great volume at that, and though our ears are still recovering, we have Exploud as our next Pokemon. Exploud is an embodiment of many sonorous concepts, such as megaphones, pipe organs, and the expression quote-unquote screaming your head off. Ever since its introduction in Generation 3 as the final evolution of the immensely likable, if excessively loud, Whismur and Loudred, Exploud has been recruited from many an in-game team and death metal band alike. Funnily enough, Exploud does come with the soundproof ability, but then again, it'd have to if it didn't want to go the way of its greatest musical inspiration, Beethoven. Today we'll be examining if Exploud's proclivity for ear-splitting antics translated to any success in the competitive scene. And so, we ask, how good was Exploud actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Exploud was not at all a suitable Pokemon for its debut generation of OU. It was completely, utterly outclassed as a normal type attacker by not just Snorlax, but even Blissey. That's how inept its offensive toolkit was. However, it found a legitimate niche for itself that saw it turn into one of the scariest Pokemon in the game. It was as specific as a niche could get, but it was a potentially integral one for the strategy it facilitated. This strategy was to act as a recipient of a +6 attack and +1 speed baton pass from Bellydrum Solak Smeargle. Now you may be thinking, okay, of course Exploud was threatening with those boosts passed to it. A lot of Pokemon were threatened to sweep OU teams at +6 attack and +1 speed. So what made Exploud a valid choice for the role at all, much less potentially an essential part of drum pass teams? Well, it was as simple as Exploud packing the soundproof ability, which allowed it to stifle any attempts to break the chain through the go-to anti-stat boosting move, Roar. In addition, soundproof also stopped the much rarer but no less devastating Perish Song Celebi. The all or nothing nature of drum pass meant it was essential the pass was not foiled by such a common tactic used by some of the best Pokemon around, like Zapdos and Suicune. While Smeargle could potentially circumvent this with restrained, well-timed use of its Spore, as it needed to do anyway in the face of a potential Whirlwind Skarmory, whose phasing would bypass soundproof, it was still not guaranteed to be able to do so. As such, it required Exploud as a teammate to ensure the success of the pass in the face of this common tactic, and Exploud was often able to sweep thanks to its serviceable attack stat, combined with a powerful stat return in conjunction with all the coverage it needed in just Shadow Ball and Earthquake, making it an offensive menace once boosted. Only needing 3 attack moves allowed Exploud to further solidify its sweeping capabilities through Taunt, which let it block utility tactics from defensive teams that could potentially take its hits even at max attack, such as Leech Seed, a second use of a status move if its Lumberry had been used up while switching in, or Whirlwind from Skarmory. Now, what made Exploud potentially essential as opposed to just essential? Well, there was another roar blocking Pokemon that competed for a similar spot, Cradily. When it came purely to blocking phasing, Cradily was better because its Suction Cup's ability blocked Skarmory's Whirlwind as well. However, that didn't mean Cradily was better overall, and Exploud seeing similar usage to it was for good reason. It's not like all it did was block Roar and Perish Song. If that was the case, then yes, Cradily would be better, but it wasn't, because Exploud's advantages were significant. First, Exploud was much stronger than Cradily, both with its significantly more powerful attack stat, with its stab return out damaging Cradily's stab rock slide by a mile, and this was absolutely huge for actually getting KOs against the tier's bulky Pokemon, thus letting it actually complete the sweep, as most notably Exploud one-hit KO'd bulky Swampert, which Cradily didn't come close to doing. And second, Exploud was much faster than Cradily, which was even more important. Even when past +1 speed, Cradily was not at all a fast Pokemon. In fact, it was so slow that it didn't even outrun timid Moltres, which was not exactly a speedster in its own right. This meant it also didn't even outspeed slow Gengar, let alone fast Gengar, and also lost out on the tier's many plus speed 100s Starmie and Dugtrio. Cradily could try to amend this by running Substitute and its own Solakberry, but this not only cut into its bulk, but also meant it had to pass up on Lumberry, rendering it unable to take status. Exploud did not have any of these issues. It outran all of the aforementioned Pokemon with just the 1 speed boost, and was still able to run Lumberry. As such, it was able to complete sweeps far more easier against popular types of offense teams that stacked fast Pokemon. Those teams packed multiple Pokemon that could outspeed and smack Cradily, eventually bringing it down and basically winning the game. But Exploud would blitz by and one-hit KO them all. Exploud's main flaw when compared to Cradily, besides not blocking Skarmory's Whirlwind, was that it was affected by Sandstorm, meaning it could potentially be stalled out with tactics like switching around and protect. However, the significant advantages Exploud brought to the table, while still blocking the most common form of phasing, made it a legitimate, feared part of drum pass teams. It was the purest definition of niche, but that niche was a terrifying one. Exploud's usage in OU completely disappeared when Baton Pass was banned on Smeargle as a result of the absurd power of Drum Pass as a whole. But those who fought against such teams knew the fear and humiliation resultant of having their teams full of Metagross and Zapdos and Celebi getting swept by none other than the final evolution of Whismur. Sadly, as terrifying as that smallest of OU niches was, that was all Exploud had in Generation 3. It stood no chance at all in UU, as not only was it completely and utterly outclassed as a normal type by the queen of the tier Kangaskhan, it was also outclassed by other normal types like Granbull for the purpose of acting as a second Kangaskhan. To make matters worse, Exploud somehow didn't drop to NU, where it would have been excellent. However, this was made up for by Exploud's occasional ventures into OU for a fun time wreaking havoc upon Tyranitar and friends. And as such, it was certainly an unconventional debut generation for our loudmouth friend. The drum passing strategy more or less disappeared in Generation 4, given how easy it was to disrupt with the newfound plethora of priority as well as the advent of Choice Scarf. The popularity of these as well as other tactics like Taunt made phasing almost the least of the strategy's concerns on a nearly non-existent occasion where it was used. As such, Exploud did not reprise its OU niche. What it did reprise was its complete lack of use in UU. It wasn't completely identical, as it wasn't just that Exploud was outclassed as a normal type, though it certainly was, since Kangaskhan was still around and terrifying. No, it was more that Exploud was just a bad Pokemon, as its thoroughly meager stats in conjunction with the relative uselessness of its typing just let it down too badly. A sad betrayal of its terrific offensive move pool. Exploud didn't have much better luck in NU, though it technically wasn't completely unviable. It may as well have been, as there was a reason nobody ever wanted to use it. Exploud never made a team better for having it. It was once again thoroughly outclassed as a normal type by one of the tier's best Pokemon, Tauros, but it also generally matched up poorly against pretty much everything by virtue of its poor speed and bulk, lack of resistances, and not even packing much of an offensive punch. Exploud really just didn't do anything, as Generation 4 was entirely forgettable for it. Generation 5 kindly gifted Exploud an excellent ability in the form of Scrappy, allowing its normal stat to hit ghost types. In the previous generation, Kangaskhan had demonstrated this to be an outstanding trait to have for a normal type attacker, and thus it was an exciting prospect. Sadly, not being able to hit ghost types effectively had been almost the least of Exploud's worries previously, and it hadn't received any help in addressing any of its other far more pressing issues. It was still slow, it was still frail with bland defensive typing, and it wasn't nearly strong enough to make up for it. As such, there was just about no reason to use Exploud even all the way down in NU, especially when there were so many other far better normal types to pick from, including once again Kangaskhan and Tauros. And so Exploud was completely passed over and left untiered in Generation 5. Scrappy hadn't done much for Exploud in Generation 5, but it proved to be massively beneficial come Generation 6, facilitating that absolutely incredibly new move Exploud had received. Sometimes just being able to use one move is all a Pokemon needs to become viable, and doing so becomes its defining trait. This was the case for Exploud and its Stab Boom Burst, a stunningly powerful 140 base power move and 210 after Stab. When combined with its lack of immunities thanks to Scrappy, power sufficient to rip through even most resistant Pokemon, no drawbacks such as stat drops or flaws like poor accuracy and 16 PP. This was one of the most ridiculously spammable attacks in the game, a perfect move for a choice specs user. It didn't even hit anything super effectively, but it didn't have to. Here are some examples for perspective on just how ludicrously strong Exploud's specs Boom Burst was. It one-hit KO'd Keldeo. It had good odds to one-hit KO Latios and Rotom Wash. As a neutral attack, one-hit KOing either of those, especially a special attack against Latios, was stupefying. Even Latios couldn't switch into it safely with Stealth Rock up. And Exploud wasn't just tearing through uninvested offensive Pokemon either. Chansey, every specially defensive Pokemon that was neutral to the move would crumple to it as well. From Mandibuzz to Gliscor to Assault Vest Pokemon like Azumarill and Tornadus Therian, all of them would succumb to the sheer power of Boom Burst. It wouldn't be enough to resist the move either. Especially frail Pokemon like Skarmory, Bisharp, Excadrill, and Mega Mawile were absolutely blown away. Even the rare Assault Vest Bisharp was 2-hit KO'd, but even specially bulkier Pokemon weren't necessarily safe. Max HP Heatran was cleanly 3-hit KO'd, and with Stealth Rock and or a little chip damage, even massively bulky resists like Aegislash and Ferrothorn struggled to switch into it. Mega Scizor was usually 2-hit KO'd with Stealth Rock. Plus, even if these resists were healthy enough to withstand Boom Burst, they were always one coverage move away from being destroyed. Heatran couldn't take Surf, while other steals were shredded by Fire Blast. Oh, but what about Tyranitar? with its Sandstorm special defense boost on top of its Boom Burst resistance. And if it could take a surf from Latios, surely it could take a surf from Exploud. Well, that was true, but even the mighty T-Tar wasn't safe, as Exploud sent it packing with a Focus Blast that also trashed most Steel types. Now you might be wondering, why all these examples with OU Pokemon? Did Boom Burst launch Exploud into viability? Well, yes and no. No, because as strong as Exploud was, it was still slow, frail, and lacking in resist. These examples were chosen to illustrate just how powerful it was, but also yes, because in the early stages of XY, before the formation of lower tiers, some players were eager to try Exploud's amazing power, and so they slapped it on Trick Room teams to surprisingly decent results. It wasn't a consistent strategy at all, but it wasn't trying to be. Trick Room was inherently high risk, high reward, and Exploud was the perfect Pokemon to make using it worth the effort. Not only was its low speed turned to its advantage, but it also helped guarantee the KOs that were needed to make the most of Trick Room's short duration. Exploud Trick Room teams disappeared from OU as the metagame became more definitively established and lower tiers came into existence, but those who were forced with the difficult task of withstanding its Boom Burst would not forget its incredible power. For the first time ever, Exploud faced the prospect of UU viability. Several players explored avenues to bypass its low speed. Trick Room wasn't very good, but Sticky Web teams were decent, and Exploud was a near fixture on them. Of course, Sticky Web teams were also incredibly specific, and some players experimented with using Exploud on less specialized structures. With Switch Move using teammates to bring it in safely, Exploud could reliably hit the field against slow, bulky Pokemon and start Boom Bursting anyway. It tore through early XY UU's defensive cores, as even especially bulky staples like Florges and Mew were bowled over by the sheer power of Boom Burst. Many of the tier's most popular normal resists, such as Fortress and Mega Aerodactyl, did not pack the bulk to withstand Boom Burst, while bulkier Pokemon like Empoleon and Jirachi were severely threatened by Exploud's coverage. Of course, while Exploud was a fearsome wall breaker, it was still difficult to fit on a team, even when paired with teammates that facilitated its entry, as the fact it offered next to nothing to a team's defensive integrity was a major drawback. Even a fragile wall breaker like Crawdont provided more thanks to Aqua Jet's priority and some actual resist. As such, Exploud more or less phased out of UU and didn't return to ORAS. Don't despair though, not only had it already achieved OU and UU success, it wasn't even done. Already in XY, even as it had seen sporadic use in UU, Exploud had already dropped to the tier where it would really make its name, RU. Right from day one, it established itself as one of the metagame's most prominent wall breakers and continued without stopping into and throughout ORAS. This was particularly impressive as the massively bulky Registeel was also there from the very beginning, and it ate up Boom Burst all day while not being instantly threatened by Focus Blast and grabbing recovery through Protect and Leftovers. Thus, Exploud's viability and popularity spoke to how threatening it was to everything else. Plus, even Registeel wasn't immovable. Not only could Exploud threaten itself, it also loved pairing up with teams that Registeel would also be tasked with handling, forming Registeel overwhelming combinations that would open up the avenue for an offensive team snowballing through the opponent's Registeel defensive core. Basically, the fact that Registeel was really the only thing to even semi-reliably switch into Exploud could be turned to Exploud and Exploud's team's advantage. Even the similarly bulky Diancie struggled thanks to its Stealth Rock neutrality and taking more from Boom Burst. Everything else in RU was effortlessly, mortally threatened by Exploud, and with the plethora of slow, weak defensive walls to come in on, especially with the pivoting help of teammates like Volt Switch Rotomo, there was plenty of opportunity for Exploud to consistently launch its brutal Boom Burst. It tore through the bulkiest neutral Pokemon, as even Assault Vest Slowking was cleanly 2-hit KO'd. Most resists didn't stand a chance either. Rhyperior and Escavalier were both subject to either 1-hit KOs from Exploud's coverage options or simply being bowled over by repeated Boom Bursts. Exploud was also a fixture on Sticky Web teams, which ensured even teams with plenty of fast offensive Pokemon were not safe from getting blown apart. As a bonus, even though Exploud was frail in terms of taking repeated attacks, it was actually quite good at taking one move in particular, and this made it even more difficult to deal with, as it could even withstand moves as powerful as Choice Band Flygon's Earthquake. And as a general rule, if the opposing Pokemon was able to actually dish out big damage against Exploud, there was no way it would be able to actually take an attack from Exploud, meaning that Exploud staying in and tanking the hit would be rewarded with a KO. Exploud would pretty much never sweep itself, but it wasn't supposed to. It was monstrously reliable at doing its job, which was shattering opposing teams' defensive cores, leaving easy pickings for its faster teammates to clean up. When Exploud hit the field, it's guaranteed a blowout, literally. So overall, the 6th generation was a massive success for Exploud. It saw usage, however brief, in both OU and UU, and for the first time time ever, established itself as an excellent Pokemon in its own right, as it became a defining force for its utterly monstrous power in RU. Exploud's a tricky mon to make work in a doubles context. While it carries the promise of high decibel spread damage with scrappy Boom Burst also hits your teammate in doubles, meaning it needs to be paired with a partner who can tank hits, lest you decimate your own team in the process of taking down the opponent. Exploud's low speed also means that it often needs some additional support to even start firing the cannon, usually in the form of Trick Room. Exploud was always either Specs or Life Orb, with the coverage moves you come to expect. Ice Beam, maybe Flamethrower, maybe Focus Blast, or Hammer Arm. As such, the immense power that Exploud could bring usually wasn't worth the hassle. Only a few players managed to get it on its feet, such as Bridger Snow's 16th place Long Beach Regionals finish in 2014, while Exploud came close to making a few other top cuts, such as with Nick Bailey's run at the UK Nationals in the same year. It never made it to the big stage. Generation 7's massive power creep sent Exploud tumbling down to NU, and this did not last long. Exploud completely obliterated the tier. It left carnage and destruction in its wake that made the end of Akira look like a mildly messy inconvenience in comparison. The tier's all-around low stats not only meant Boom Burst was essentially a quote-unquote delete opposing Pokemon button, but also meant that much of the tier struggled to really threaten Exploud, increasing the amount of opportunity it had to fire Boom Burst off. Whatever was placed in front of Exploud would vanish in a flash. One Boom Burst later. It was downright impossible to check at all, let alone check reasonably. Players resorted to soundproof Pokemon, which were immune to Boom Burst. Mr. Mime and Electrode were not good Pokemon in their own right, but they were pretty much the only things around capable of preventing Exploud from destroying something. They were, of course, still hit hard by Exploud's coverage moves, but at least they could then pivot out to something else that would not be getting evaporated by Specs Boom Burst. Funnily enough, there was one other soundproof Pokemon capable of stopping Boom Burst. That's right, it was Exploud itself. This was riskier, as it did need Scrappy to eviscerate Sableye, as opposed to getting completely walled by it. But if one was willing to take that chance, they would be able to reap the amazing potential reward of having an Exploud that switched into and blanked Boom Burst from the opposing Exploud, giving one's own Exploud even more opportunity to come in and fire off its own Boom Burst. This obscenely chaotic, Exploud-centric metagame was unhealthy to say the least. Thus, Exploud was banned in the early stages of the NU tier. With its greatest achievement yet already under its belt, Exploud looked to keep its success going in RU. Sadly, it had a much more difficult time keeping up with the tier this time around, as the metagame was far stronger and faster. Even pivot move teammates couldn't really solve the issue, as Exploud simply didn't match up well against enough of the metagame. Sticky web teams were immensely unreliable as a whole, so that wasn't an option either. Some players tried to make Exploud work on occasion, as after all, there's nothing more rewarding than Boom Burst spam. And it wasn't bad. It certainly threatened common defensive cores. However, it simply didn't offer enough to teams to ever be a consistent choice. Plus, it was outclassed by another scrappy Boom Burst Pokemon, Swellow, whose incredible speed made it much more threatening. As a result, Exploud remained in NUBL. However, this alone made Generation 7 a success for it, chalking up the second in a row for our friend who would simply not be silenced. Exploud joined the fray in Generation 8's first DLC, the Isle of Armor, and brought with it excitement, as players rejoiced over the prospect of firing off its powerful Boom Burst once again. It started things off with its best ever UU showing. It established itself as a staple on sticky web offense, and thanks to Exploud's KO forcing power propelling them to tournament success, webs in turn became an established playstyle in its own right. Many opposing teams were sorely lacking in sturdy normal resist, tending to packing nothing bulkier than Terrakion and offensive Jirachi variants, and were thus immensely prone to getting trampled by Boom Burst once their ability to outspeed Exploud was taken away. Exploud was unable to maintain this niche into the Crown Tundra, as the UU metagame was shaken up by power creep, but for a time it was one of the most feared Pokemon around. Now, since Exploud's UU usage was mostly tied to the specialized style of Sticky Web, it wasn't the most common Pokemon in the tier, which meant it simultaneously existed in RU. There, it didn't even need Sticky Web. The tier's slow pace of play meant Exploud had plenty of Pokemon to prey on. Such plentiful opportunity was a particular perilous prospect to the metagame's complete dearth of safe switch-ins. There were a few Pokemon that could handle Boom Burst decently, like Bronzong, Escavalier, Copperajah, Klefki, Steelix, Rhyperior, and Gigalith, but each and every one of those were crushed by either Fire Blast or Surf, and even Steelix and Rhyperior weren't exactly amazing at taking Boom Burst in the first place. To make things even more terrifying, it was easier than ever to get Exploud on the field, since in addition to good old U-turn and Volt Switch, there were even even more switch moves now in the form of Flip Turn and a buffed Teleport, making it simple for already valuable support Pokemon like Milotic to make Exploud even scarier. As a result of Exploud grabbing opportunities against and smashing through huge portions of teams, the player base realized they could no longer run so many slow Pokemon and attempt to patch their speed issue through one Pokemon. Thus, in response, they began running more aggressive Pokemon and team styles. The metagame shifted, becoming faster and more offensive, and it started to center itself around combinations of threats like Gardevoir, Passimian, Salazzle, and Toxicroak. This made it immensely difficult for Exploud to find opportunities to switch in, and therefore to do anything at all, since it didn't have any defensive utility. However, though it was no longer the behemoth that ripped through pretty much everything, Exploud still had a highly valuable place in the tier. Though slow, bulky teams were no longer the dominant, commonplace force they had been previously, as they were still very much present. As such, though it was more difficult to get consistent use out of, Exploud retained its place as a destroyer of such teams. It ensured they could never get too comfortable, knowing that it was lurking around the corner. When the Crown Tundra came around, fellow Boomburst user Toxtricity dropped to RU, and it completely and utterly outclassed Exploud. Though we would absolutely love to hear a band with Toxtricity on guitar and Exploud on vocals, the player base just wanted to hear Toxtricity, so Exploud left over what everyone agreed to politely refer to as creative differences. It started its new musical journey in NU, where it offered a similar yet refreshing take on its established sound. It had really perfected what it did, as this was its most fearsome incarnation yet, thanks to the tier's generally low stat spreads, which made a vast majority of Pokemon easy pickings. Exploud effortlessly switched in and boom bursted its way through the generally slow, weak tier, grabbing opportunities against stables like Mudsdale, Vileplume, and Xatu, and threatening pretty much everything. As while there were plenty of normal resists, there weren't too many capable of handling Boom Burst. The tier's multitude of ghost types did nothing thanks to Scrappy, and other popular resists like Dual Blade, Rhydon, and Tyrantrum could hardly even be considered resists at all. The list of Pokemon capable of switching into Boom Burst was more or less limited to familiar faces Bronzong, Diancie, Copperajah, and Escavalier, who were, of course, a coverage move away from being destroyed, to say nothing of the difficulty they faced just in taking repeated Boom Bursts over the course of a game. Exploud tore through the tier so badly that some players resorted to using heat-proof Bronzong just so it could take Overheat and Fire Blast, and some went even further in giving it rest so it wouldn't be overwhelmed by repeated Boom Bursts. But Exploud adapted to even this by incorporating Shadow Ball into its moveset, a coverage move that Bronzong couldn't change its ability to handle. At the time of this video, Exploud ranks as one of the NU's most powerful threats. The tier's low power level and plethora of switch moves make it easy for it to consistently find opportunities to fire off its devastating Boom Burst. So overall, the 8th generation has been another massively successful one for Exploud, and it doesn't look to be easing up anytime soon. And that's it. So how good was Exploud actually? Well, it didn't start out so great, though it had a small unique niche in Gen 3 OU as a recipient of Belly Drum Baton Pass thanks to soundproof blocking the would-be foil of Roar. It wasn't a very good Pokemon in its own right and was pretty much always outclassed by normal types, leading to see no usage in any tier throughout Generation 5. However, Generation 5 did at least give it Scrafty, and the payoff was delayed, but man oh man was it worth it when Generation 6 gave Exploud another buff, which was pretty much the best thing it could have asked for: Boom Burst. With this move in conjunction with the Ghost 9 capability of Scrappy, Specs Exploud clicked its stat with effortlessness. That was the envy of the best Pokemon in the game, and did so across multiple lower tiers for the next 3 generations, from UU to RU to NU, even getting banned in the lattermost tier. Exploud has proved one thing: when you're faced with a problem, all you have to do is yell really, really loud. Just kidding, don't do that. Instead, relish in the heartwarming reminder that sometimes Game Freak does bestow kindness upon its creatures. This easily could have been one of a million perpetually passed over normal types, but no. Instead, with one ability and one move, Exploud became one of the most ferocious Pokemon to even battle in the lower tiers. Also remembering that a band consisting of Exploud and Toxtricity, aka the perfect mix of death metal and punk rock, is something the world needs to hear, and we fully expect Game Freak to include their debut album in an upcoming game. Thanks for watching everyone, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Exploud? Would you give it more things than just Boom Burst? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.